For those of you who haven't been here for the past 2 days, I'm Todd Katzner, and I'm the local representative on the scientific committee. And as I've said for the past couple of days, when the scientific committee and the Carolina Raptor Center sort of started talking about plenaries, we didn't want to just sort of put up random people who were famous. We wanted to come up with plenaries that were sort of relevant to the local area, that were relevant to raptor conservation in the Southeast, relevant to the mission of our host. And so we've had 2 awesome plenaries, one on golden eagles, which are in North Carolina as well as throughout the East. And we had one on black vultures yesterday, which are, one of, if not the biggest raptor conservation problem in the Southeast, or at least long-term raptor conservation problem in the Southeast. And then today's is one of the emerging and highly important raptor conservation and wildlife health issues in the Southeast and the nation, which is avian influenza and raptors. So today's talk is entitled Highly Pathogenic Avian Influenza, an Additional Threat to the Health and Conservation of Raptors. Our speaker, who I will introduce, is Dr. Nicole Nemeth. And I'm excited about this. Well, I'm excited about all the plenary talks. But Nicole is an associate professor and head of the Research and Diagnostic Service at the Southeast Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study, which I will not repeat again. I will just call SQUIDIS. And it's got a really cool acronym. And that's at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Georgia in Athens, not Greece, but Georgia. Her research interests are diverse and aimed at gaining a better understanding of natural disease and free-ranging wildlife to ultimately contribute to management and conservation. Themes in her work vary from pathogenesis, including susceptibility to infection and disease, transmission, pathogen shedding, and tissue tropism, to utilization of diagnostic modalities and health surveys to better understand epidemiology and potential health risks. I think that's the last part full of words that I don't normally use, and so I should be able to get through the rest of this. The species groups of interest for Nicole's work are constantly expanding and currently include, most importantly, raptors, as well as some lesser species, such as upland game birds, corvids, and snakes. And in fact, the picture of Nicole, and she does look like this normally. She shed the mask, took a shower. She is holding a lesser species, but importantly for this meeting, Nicole is one of the national leaders in study of wildlife disease with a focus on high pathogenicity, avian influenza, HPAI, which, as all of you know, has been in the news a lot recently. Her recent work has really been of critical importance in empirically tying avian influenza to demographic responses of bald eagle populations in the southeastern US. And because avian influenza is such a high-profile conservation, we wanted to have someone speak to the issue who's doing work that's specifically relevant in this region and who's publishing recent literature on it. And so Dr. Nemeth is really an ideal person for that and to address this issue at our conference. So, Nicole, thank you for your time. Come on, well, let's, I'll try to do that. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This is a huge honor for me. When I saw that I had an email from Todd Katzner in my email box, that was a great day. So it's really exciting to be here, you guys. I'm a little bit jacked up. I'm actually trying to stand still and be calm because I have so many things I want to tell you about. And in the meantime, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself because I miss my calling as a raptor biologist. So I have an envy to all of you for some reason, I couldn't get into grad school in conservation and wildlife biology, so I took a weird little turn to try to pursue getting into veterinary school, which it took me on another whole path. So my trade is wildlife pathology, so that's the training. That was all based on getting back to wildlife conservation. All my training has been about let's get back. I don't get to go in the field much, but I did start out working in Costa Rica for some years. I have another lesser group of birds I like, which are cetaceans. And I got to work with Dr. Joe Morrison, another highlight of my life, an icon in this field, and got to do field work down there with her on Caracaras. Spent quite a few years at the Rocky Mountain Raptor program. So I kind of was like the little kid that wanted to get my hands on birds whenever I could. So, and even my little claim to connection with the Peregrine Fund, which is pretty minimal at best, because I got to work on a project out in Hawaii on endangered Hawaiian birds. That's the Alalauda endangered Hawaiian crow. And they were funding that project for a long time, but they had turned it over to the San Diego Zoo by the time, so I couldn't put it on my resume. So I was always depressed about that as a youngster. But anyway, so sorry to talk about myself, but I wanted to set up why I'm here and how I have access to the information I'm going to share with you. And that is, now I'm a wildlife pathologist, but I teach and I get to work with students and do research on this. But I'm all trying to use the diagnostic information, the wildlife from the field, to turn it back to what is going on with them, what are the threats to their health, and how can we help you all understand management. And I love understanding your work, what you see, and what the birds do, because you can't do this kind of work without knowing the species biology, which I'll always be deficient in. And we work with a lot of wildlife throughout the Southeast, so we'll take just about anything. I don't do fish, so I'm always like, we got to find a fish pathologist if you need someone to look at your fish. But we do, every day, we do what you see right here. Oops, let me get we necropsy wildlife. And so it's the sad end because we get the dead wildlife, but we want to use what we can see from them to learn and again, try to get back information. So you may be wondering why I put this crazy deer. This is a deer with an antleroma. I don't really like tumors. Wildlife don't get a ton of tumors, but this is an aptly named tumor, an antleroma, because look, check out the antlers. But anyway, we see just about anything. This is actually a squirrel. And we'll just work it up and try to figure out what's going on anytime we get anything in. So every day, that's kind of what our routine is. So a little overview, I've got to talk to you a little bit about avian influenza viruses. They are very complex and much over my head, but I want to give you what you need to understand what we're going to talk about. And then, of course, we're going to bring that quickly into talking about the current outbreak, but it really was hitting hard in 2022, the hardest hit that we were. How that hit home with us in the Southeast, as Todd said, or in the U.S. and North America and the Western Hemisphere, really. These viruses don't respect borders, like we always say about wildlife as well. We're going to talk about what we know about this virus. It's not limited to wild birds, even though that's what we all care about. But I think it's important to point out some of the other things that are going on with it in other species. And then we'll focus a little bit on the things I've worked on the most with this virus is bald eagles and black vultures. So we're going to have to hone in on them a little bit to share some information and then just talk about the implications of all this. And then if I have time, you're going to have to forgive me because I can't help, because we see all these things in raptors. I want to share a tiny bit of the other things that we see that I also see as threats. So there was some mention yesterday in one of the afternoon sessions about One Health. And so this is a concept where I think of it more kind of interface between domestic animals, wild animals, humans, and environment. And this concept, I think, really came out of human medicine, the One Health, if you've heard of that. Apparently, I'm told it's dropping out of favor, so I always thought it was a weird kind of, as a wildlife person, we think we're always doing One Health, right? Because we're always thinking about how to wildlife interact with the environment, and when there's implications on human activities and really domestic, coming from a veterinary background, you know, we have to think about domestic animals, even though those are definitely lesser species to all the domestics in my view. But anyway, is what's that? Oh, yes. So now these viruses, I'm lucky at Squidus, our group is lucky, we have a very strong research team that's been studying influenza viruses in wild birds for like 30 years. So we kind of constantly draw from them, and they run all our samples, and we're in a good position. So that was very helpful to us, and they're always teaching me about these viruses. But really, the thing to understand, if you don't want to get into the complexities, which I won't, I can't. I don't understand that well, but these are globally distributed. I'm saying viruses, which you might think sounds weird, but there's many, many of these viruses. There's low pathogenic and there's high pathogenic. We'll talk about that in a minute. But these viruses also have many they have proteins on the surface, which is what's sticking off of this, and then they have the genome inside the virus, which is segmented, and it has all these segments. So just take from that that's what makes these viruses rapidly changing. They reassort these genetic components internally, and when they infect the host, they can combine different viruses with each other within the host. It's one thing that makes people so scared of these viruses, because they can change, and they could very quickly become more pathogenic and more transmissible in humans. As a wildlife pathologist, we use the human angle whenever we can. If it's a threat to humans, we'll exploit that to try to get attention for the wildlife. So very complex, constantly evolving. Our colleague Dave Stalnick, who's the influenza guru of wild birds of the century, he says these viruses have a hallmark of surprise. So don't try to predict what they're going to do. That's why they always miss on the human seasonal influenza vaccines. They don't always get it right. They try to take the previous year's subtypes that have been circulating the most, and they try to make a guess about what they're going to combine and reassort and do. And so sometimes they miss the boat on that, and they don't protect us at all. But that's the challenge of the human. We don't have the human pressures with us. But it's also very important to realize the natural reservoirs are wild birds themselves. But I'm going to keep saying it, the lesser species, but we're talking about shorebirds and waterfowl. These birds have evolved with these viruses, and they've been carrying these viruses across the globe. That's why it's global. When they're migrating and they have stopover sites, we'll talk a little bit about that coming up here. But they're shedding these viruses constantly, and they're sharing them with each other and anybody else that comes into contact. And that's another thing that makes these viruses so dangerous and infecting different hosts. So they're constantly changing as they infect more and more hosts. So these birds have traditionally not been affected by these viruses. So to some of us that study wildlife disease, it's like, oh my God, a high path, because when I hear high path AI, I know as a bird lover, that can kill any bird really, and it can kill them fast. They're normally these low pathogenicity viruses that are circulating, but these low pathogenicity can become high pathogenicity as they're changing genetically. So very complicated, and even as we know, they can spill over into mammals, which we'll touch on shortly as well. They're not limited to birds, and because mammals aren't the normal host, it can be pretty nasty, pretty pathogenic or virulent, whatever fancy virus word you want to use. It can kill mammals too. And we'll talk briefly about poultry in a minute. They are constantly at risk. Really, I would say the average person, at least the average veterinarian, would definitely think of poultry when you talk about influenza. That's what's going to come to their mind. And maybe the average person, because it's probably the bird group that gets the most attention, and it can be devastating to poultry. Poultry people live in fear of these viruses constantly, and that's why biosecurity in poultry facilities is generally extremely tight. Probably not as tight as it could be in some places. They won't admit that, but it's tight. I mean, you can't go in there. You can't come on property and things like that. And you got to, clean trucks. You got to wear special clothes, change out, shower, things like that. Another very important thing is that they persist in the environment. They're not just a nice type of virus that sheds out. A bird maybe defecates it on the ground, and it's going to dry up. Some viruses are pretty wimpy. They'll just dry up and become inactive pretty quick, or they're inactivated by sunlight or certain temperature conditions and things like that. Not these viruses, unfortunately. So we've talked about the fact that they're transmitted. They're transmitted because these wild reservoirs, especially waterfowl and shorebirds, they poop out the virus, into the environment. So anybody work with ducks in captivity, they poop a lot. So anyways, they're shedding it, lots and lots of virus, and they're ingesting it in the water. So shedding it into the water, ingesting it in the water, which is why if you've heard anything about influenza virus ecology, it is that they're in the water, for the most part. And that's why we don't think of raptors as being highly at risk, only in certain situations we'll talk about. But getting a little more nitty gritty, well, first I do want to say you don't need a bird to contact a bird. You could have a bunch of birds pass through a stopover site on migration into a water body, shed a lot of virus, pooping and whatnot, bathing, they're kind of like when they're flapping and bathing, it's going in the air, so you could inhale it too, but ingestion is more common in birds. I think you can get a higher dose that way. But anyway, you don't need the birds. Those birds can leave. Some other birds come. They have no contact with those birds, but they're going to get it from the water. So that's, it perpetuates the cycle that way. And that's why the virus detections amp up a lot during migratory time, so right about now. But because I'm a pathologist, I'll just tell you that they infect and spread like the lining cells in our nasal and our respiratory tract and in our gastrointestinal tract. So both tracts they can do, but they basically can go to the blood very quickly if they're highly pathogenic and into the brain. And that's how they're going to cause some disease, which we're going to look at some disease birds too shortly. And I should have said that the low and the high pathogenicity characterization that you hear, that determination is based on what it does to poultry. So if it kills poultry readily and quickly, it's high path. If it doesn't, it's low path. And so that doesn't always help us with wild birds, but that essentially that does maintain true. When it's going to kill poultry, it's probably going to kill other bird species. But that's how it goes back to poultry, is to kind of the basics of what we know about what these viruses do in birds. But sadly, we know it can be rapidly fatal because we've seen that a lot. So a little bit more about the virus, but more like the history and the geography, because you may wonder, well, these viruses are constantly circulating. So we have a lot of them in North America. We always have. And we rarely see the high path because they've been circulating more commonly in like Asia. And they have made some incursions into Europe more recently. And I'm going back with this particular strain that we have now, which I was going to mention. It's kind of a mouthful. It's like a goose guangdong clade 2.3.4.4b virus, because they have all these genetics to it. But it stems back to this Asian virus from 1996. And that did have, there were I can't remember the name of the lake in China, but there was some famous papers and a famous outbreak on a park, and they killed a bunch of waterfowl, the viruses did. So anyway, this goes back to that, but then the virus has been changing. So as Dave Stonek has said, it's had some 30 years almost, to keep evolving. And then we had a little scare in 2014-15 where we did have an outbreak in North America, and it was related to this virus. It's changed since. And there was a blurb, like there was some poultry, they have to depopulate, it's devastating. And we had a few wild birds, but not very many, it was very limited, but the big hit and the big story was poultry during that time. I think there was a falconry bird or two that got infected and died, and it was contaminated food probably at that point. But then it wasn't a surprise, but it was a surprise because people always kind of, oh my God, it hit the eastern coast of Canada in 2021 and very rapidly moved down the Atlantic flyway. We're down in Georgia, and we work a lot with Florida. And so we were highly aware when waterfowl started dying in Florida. It didn't take long. And that was like, holy wow, and we're going to talk a tiny bit about how it's kept spreading south. It's not going to stop as birds are migrating. You can imagine some of them keep going on down south, as we've heard over and over at this conference. So Todd mentioned it. It's got a lot of attention. It's got a lot of research attention, which is valid. I mean, there's people purely dedicated to these viruses that study this for years and years and years, and just certain aspects of them. And so, there's stories coming out. I like some of these papers where they were sort of at the transition. They either, like when it moved to North America, you can find a lot of information on this. There's been work now on what it's been doing here. I think there's going to be a lot of more publications coming out in the next few years. I know we're behind on the stuff we've seen that we want to share. And I just like this figure because these guys show a little bit of a pictorial, timing demonstration of that 1996. We had in domestic fowl, at any point, and this is where in Asia where they have a lot of domestic fowl, like in farms, in concentrated areas, on ponds, and kind of small ponds, and living closely with people, actually. I'm not going to hit a lot about the human health aspect, but feel free to ask questions about it. I don't get super excited about it, but yes, people can die from it. But it's very, 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 very rare, and you have to be in extremely close contact with the virus, and working with it probably in occupational setting or that sort of thing. I think we got questions about, can we swim in lakes and things, when the outbreak was happening, and I mean, really, the risk is extraordinarily low. I wouldn't worry about it. If I had kids, I'd plop them in the lake. So anyway, but you can see this timing going on, and it just kind of shows you what I just tried to tell you, but in a picture, where if you look at all these genetic things, there's people always working on the genetics and always figuring out which strain and what it arose from and what its history. This one emerged in poultry. They always go back and forth between poultry and wild birds too. That's a big risk. They change, and then they sometimes get worse for wild birds in poultry. So I really like this paper. I'm not gonna harp on it, but it was a paper that came out, folks, in the Netherlands, in Boedio, and they showed these lesions just before our outbreak, what they saw, and they talked about it being ingested by raptors. And I know this looks not fun, but this is brain tissue, and this is a regular stain. And all these are little neurons, and over here you see staining. This is where we can do a stain on the slide for virus antigen, and all the dark purple or kind of reddish purple is where there's a lot of virus inside those neurons. And neurons is a really common and important cell in the brain. So when you get that, that's why you're going to see neurologic disease. And this is just heart muscle. I think that Tori gave a great talk yesterday on high path and raptors, and it hits the heart muscle too. And this is also just showing there's a lot of virus in this heart muscle. The heart's not going to be able to keep doing its job when it looks like that. But so we've seen similar lesions to the raptors in Europe. So that's why I like that paper. So where we sit at Squid is we get a lot of samples from across the southeast generally, from any wildlife that's native free-ranging wildlife that they want to send. And so we're in constant contact with these biologists, the state agency wildlife biologists and veterinarians. And they, we hear what's going on. We want to know what's going on because it helps us know what's coming. And so, we're getting stories like sickly waterfowl. These are little neighborhood areas, like there are many, many in Florida, sickly looking ducks, areas where there's intermingling of different kind of aquatic wildlife. So we're getting a little picture of like, oh, there's observations going on in Florida. That's the first place that we heard of high path in the U.S. for us, from our ears. I think the first case was in a healthy waterfowl in like one of the Carolinas, I believe. That was actually the detection during that outbreak. But stories like this continued. Sick gulls. Really, any bird can become infected with these avian influenza viruses. There's no bird that would not be susceptible to infection. What it's going to do in them will vary, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But very devastating to people working hands-on with wildlife and rehabilitators and veterinarians and dedicated folks like that. They had to, public health had to warn people not to take in these birds or to euthanize them immediately, but really just not even take them in. So it was very hard on the public and people working in animal and wildlife health at this time. So here we are, we're in our necropsy room, and this is the kind of stuff we're seeing, a whole variety of birds coming in high numbers where we kind of buried every day. We get shipment. Most of our stuff is shipped, and we just what are all these boxes? So boxes and boxes of dead of everything. A lot of waterfowl for sure, but a lot of raptors too. So I apologize. I'm going to show some sickly clinical sign birds. I just want you to see what people were seeing in the field. It's hard for some people to watch this I have a very hard time. It's very, very hard to watch these. But this is what people were seeing in the field, and they would send us so that we could get a good idea. It's very helpful to see what they can see. Here's a couple more, just to make you more sad. A snow goose in this cornfield is just so upsetting. I mean, this was a bird, obviously someone took in because it's sitting on a towel. People did try. You'd get sort of anecdotal reports of people took in a ruddy duck, it's in the bathtub in their house, and I mean, I of course think the wildlife first like you guys would, but people have to think about the public health aspect, and that had to be highly, highly discouraged for people to take them in, but it was so hard for people they were showing up in people's yards and things. So the USDA initially maintained this map, and USGS now maintains this map, and it's a beautiful map of all the cases. And this is kind of the summary. Because most of the cases were in 2022, 2021, this is kind of the gist of what we saw during those years. And you can see the different colors in the bottom. It's kind of small, but poultry is red. And then we have, if you want to look at, oh my God, it's because of my eyes. Non-commercial poultry, we didn't talk about backyard poultry, but that's an important piece of this. Those are yellow, wild birds are the green, and wild mammals are the blue. So that just shows you what we saw, and Canada has a very active mapping and surveillance as well, so they've been really good about keeping up. You don't see anything, of course, south of the border, which that's not accurate. Obviously, there are surely many, many birds dying in Mexico. We just, unfortunately, it's hard to represent, and they might not be doing as much heavy-duty surveillance and reporting. But I want to remind that, okay, you can go to the USGS website. It's wonderful. You can download their database of all the cases, and any case that tested positive initially in a sort of satellite lab had to go through them for confirmation, the National Veterinary Services Lab in Ames, Iowa. So any of these things you see here were the officially detected lab-tested birds in the U.S. at that time. There's been more, but not so many, so the map hasn't changed a huge amount. But I want to point out that some of these are in healthy waterfowl that are hunter harvest. There's a lot of surveillance that's been going on for influenza via the USDA constantly. It depends on the funding, so it's gotten less, and ironically, it was a little bit less before this outbreak, I believe. But some of these are healthy birds that test positive, and the database will tell you where it came from, and if it's healthy hunter harvest. Our birds are all represented on there, and they are all birds that died or had to be euthanized. But really important is to recognize that maybe one dot, we work with Kansas, that's one of our states, they had a horrible time of it with migrating snow geese, and so dots you see there sometimes represented where we get one or two carcasses, so that's representing one bird, one dot. But the report from the field was thousands of snow geese are dying in this flock around this lake. So each dot is, in some cases, representative of hundreds or thousands of birds, which is crazy. And the same thing kind of happened with vultures. We get one or two vultures from a roost where maybe they were reporting hundreds dying. So just keep that in mind. I try to keep that in mind, especially when I'm telling that to people. So we talked about, this has really been a virus that circulated between waterfowl and shorebirds and kind of maintained this sort of calm cycle of low pathogenic viruses. But then when this high path, a pretty huge proportion of the number of cases have been raptors, like quite huge. And we'll talk about why that is shortly. Poultry, like I said, we know none of us are like as fanatics about poultry, but the importance is that it is very agriculturally recognized risk, and so that's something that you cannot separate the poultry scene epidemiologically from the wild birds, and that's what people fear, and you guys probably know this, they like to really blame wild birds for spread of pathogens a lot of the time. So, I mean, I blame the poultry farm, like, not backyard poultry, because there's not much you can do about protecting them. But, you know, these poultry facilities do just need to work on biocontainment, and I don't think you can always blame the wild birds. Sometimes it's equipment. You know, they do spread it. They can spread it transcontinentally. But sometimes these viruses actually go from poultry back into wild birds, and that's a huge risk for the wild birds. A lot of times that's how the birds actually get these highly pathogenic viruses. The poultry is where the viruses can change. But just to give you a touch of it, millions and millions and millions of poultry affected. And the reason there's millions, and that means killed, is because when if a farm has 3 million poultry, and some of them are that big, you have to depopulate the entire farm if there's a positive. So it's devastating, and that aspect in itself is devastating. I'm not going to think about it, and the fact that when they have to kill that many birds, it's horrible. But horribly devastating. So that's why I have to point it out, because the connection and because the importance of it. But back to wildlife, we also talk briefly about wild mammals, because there's spillover of these viruses. So if there's a dead waterfowl with high path on the landscape, guaranteed it has loads of virus if it died of high path during this outbreak. So any little fox or raccoon or whoever come along takes a bite because they're smart. They're like, ooh, nice, easy thing to eat. You know, we've had cases. They can get this. I don't know what proportion. It got a huge amount of press. Like, I don't know if 1 out of 100 bobcats that eats a carcass that's infected, I don't know if one would show signs of disease or, you know, 100 out of 100. We don't have a good idea of that, but we do see very severe brain lesions and disease in these guys. The numbers haven't been astounding. Like, most of these numbers probably do represent one animal. You know, it's usually single animal settings. It's not like a group of 100, you know, they just don't, as we know, they just don't roam that way together. But black bears, some other interesting thing, we'll talk a little bit about South America, but seals, they're in the water near the coast, intermingling with these wild birds in the water, so they have a possibility of ingesting virus as well. So a whole variety of mammal species, really, in humans. So again, I know none of us cares much about human health, but it can infect humans. So this was another big story that's actually ongoing. It's probably the biggest story right now, getting the most attention of these high path viruses. It was detected in dairy cattle. So in a lot of ways, USDA had to go, oh my God, we have to pull our resources from testing wild birds, and now we've got to deal with this cattle situation. And it's my understanding that this kind of started in Texas, and then unfortunately they had already started moving some cattle from that farm, like they do out west to other western states, and so it kind of quickly spread. It's been mostly in the western US, but there's been quite a number of cases. It contaminates the milk, so again, it's a big issue for agriculture and for these farms. I'll be honest, I don't know for 100% certain, but I doubt that they depopulate the farms. They may quarantine the cattle, but a lot of these farms are just open, you know, so there's a lot of talk about, like, you know, open exposure. And really, it's very possible that the virus was moved via human, like on their, you know, equipment moved in, or clothing, or things like that they picked up from the environment. So anyway, this was an unfortunate kind of spillover event, but now it's causing major headaches for USDA. And USDA has a very good website that shows, you know, these cases and tracks them and has recommendations for biosafety, and they will help these farms if they are worried or if they think they have cases and things like that. So there's a lot of effort to contain this, but obviously the kind of cow got out of the bag because it kind of moved around like it did before they had a handle on it. So that's important. And I should have said, again, I'm not as worried about humans, but there have been a few human cases from this, the cattle. And these were cattle workers that worked very close, milking the cows and things like that, very close contact and quite prolonged contact with the virus, which is in the milk for one, and in some of the tissues too. So this has been another devastating story, and it brings questions, but a lot of aquatic birds, especially like pelicans and cormorants, have died along, especially like roosting, I shouldn't say roosting, nesting areas, concentrated nesting areas along the coast of South America, to the point where like entire nesting colonies have been devastated. And in addition, many, many pinnipeds have died, and that's been a huge concern for other wildlife health folks. I'm more focused on the birds, as you guys know, but that's a huge other story. And up and down the coast, including in the northeast U.S., there's been quite a few seals, and down in South America, walruses and things like that also dying that have contact with these birds in high concentrations. Even rarely, there's been a few detections in dolphins, because again, they're in the water. We talked about the ecology. The viruses are in the water, and they're mixing with everybody in the water. I have myself not heard a peep about raptors in South America, but it's hard for me to believe there's not been deaths, but we'll talk about that. I think there's just so much variation in species biology and ecology and the areas they use and what they eat that it could change their susceptibility to getting exposed to the virus at the very least. So I just kind of put this up there to show like this, all of our beautiful raptors and the different activities they do and where they tend to hang out more and the things they tend to eat. That has a lot of implication as to whether they're going to see this virus. Raptors that are closer to water bodies and spend more time there, and coastlines and things like that is where we've seen more of it. The black vultures is its own interesting case, which we'll talk about, but ones maybe more inland, we don't find them, But these guys, like these caracaras, if they're eating a mammal, certainly that mammal could be infected. Not that many mammals are probably. Well, we don't know. I shouldn't even say that. We just don't know how many mammals are dying on the landscape. We've been trying to do a little bit of work on that, but we haven't detected it in mammals for a while now, in wild mammals. So this is the list on the USGS website of all the raptors in the US that have been submitted, samples from them submitted, so they were dead, and they detected this virus, the high path virus. And I kind of wish I would have put it in numerical instead of alphabetical, but bald eagles, black vultures, red-tailed hawks, and great horned owls, of course, the highest numbers, because those are the highest numbers out there in many places, right? And maybe the most visible, so there's a ton of bias, of course, as to what's tested, a ton of bias. Like, who knows if kestrels could be really susceptible, but there's only been 4 in this database. And like I say, if anything tests positive in the US, it's really supposed to go through this lab for confirmation. They're a little bit backlogged at this point. But that gives you a little bit of an idea of the huge array, like even osprey, so that's pretty interesting. I don't know, there have been studies on how these viruses filter in like mollusks and other aquatic organisms that our raptors might eat. So that's kind of interesting if they picked it up from the water, or from maybe it was the viruses were inside of a fish that, was in the water. But again, I go back to South America, what's going on down there, probably more badness. So we're gonna talk a little bit about these two specifically. We got a lot of these, and we had a chance to observe a lot of what was going on and talk to a lot of people about what was going on in the field. So this was devastating. Early in 2022, we started getting a lot of raptors, a lot of dead eagles, I should say, bald eagles, with histories of nesting, because it was spring. And they were like, well, one adult was found dead right beneath the nest. 2 days later, the chicks were found dead beneath the nest. The other breeding pair, individual was never seen again, or probably left or died somewhere else that they didn't find. So this was awful. I guess get goosebumps thinking about. And there was many stories of this, right? So we decided we just wanted to try to document that, because we wanted to share that was happening. And this really was we worked very closely with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and Georgia Department of Natural Resources. They were and are amazing, and Shanley's in here. Florida Audubon, Eagle Watch is amazing. They have so much information, and they amazingly track through Shanley all these eagle nests down in Florida, of which there are many, many. So this was very, very devastating and sad, and almost inconceivably sad. So again, through this collaboration that we did, it was mostly just wise people that I just mentioned, and Bob Sargent might be in here somewhere. He's extremely wise, and a lot of this is his data and the Eagle Watch data, where we just wanted to try to document past year's nesting success versus the high path year nesting success. That's my little brain's ability, but if anyone needs to know more, we go talk to Shanley and Bob. But we did kind of just a comparison of Georgia DNR and Florida knew all these nest sites for many years and monitor them. So that was like a golden data set. And then the high path year, we were just like, this seems horrible. Like I said, we were getting these histories and seeing these birds come in. And Anyway, put it all together, we could see that there were pretty serious declines in the nest success of these nests. And this came out in 2023. But that, and even decrease in brood size productivity in these nests. And most of these were along the coast. And in Florida, we just had a few counties we focused on because we knew there was a lot of virus transmission going on. They had a lot more data than that, but we had to make it doable. And this is where a lot of these, especially scaup, and at that time were coming down and dying. There was a lot of waterfowl dying along the coast at that time, and they were just, that's what they're eating, is easy. So that's kind of the take-home message there, there was a pretty big dip in productivity that year, and we didn't know what was going to happen the next year. Luckily, we didn't see that the following years. But it's still, you still kind of feel like you're on pins and needles about it because you don't know. Forgive me for this, but I've got to show you. If you need to look away, look away. Apologize about the noisy. Thanks to Chris Kent, actuariologist right here in North Carolina, Wildlife Resources Commission. This is, again, devastating. This is the things that we were hearing of and seeing. I would say this eagle was lucky in the sense that he was seen and captured and humanely euthanized. Because this is just devastating. This eagle is not going to recover from this. You know, even if you brought him in, I mean, all the dedicated wildlife health care people, I know there's many in the room, I mean, they would put their heart and soul into recovering these birds. It's very, very rare. It is a very poor prognosis in getting a bird through this virus. It's all throughout their body and in their brain, as you can see. It's showing neurologic signs. So sorry for the internal stuff. It's not that bloody. You don't see bloody, but you see spleen and liver. And the reason I have to show you this is, I'll show you a little bit more later, but that was a very consistent pattern. We could pretty much open a black vulture. You can't rely on this, you still have to test it, but look at the spleen and liver and go, surely that one's positive. And just take I'm gonna have a normal liver to show you later, but this liver is swollen because the edges are rounded, it's pale, it's got these spots, different look of spots, smaller spots on a liver. These are all bald eagles, and these spleens are also, again, you have to take my word, they're swollen. This is very common for birds with any virus, okay? Like any bad virus infection would like to go to the liver and the spleen and make them look big. But we saw this very characteristic pattern. These spots correspond to areas of virus and then corresponding cell death in the tissue. And it would just be loads of cell death, like very much tissue just dead. And we really, and this is a heart, and it's just not right. If any hunters in here, they cut open a deer or something, you can compare that. Like they should have a nice uniform colored, kind of darkish mahogany, whatever colored heart. This has just got a lot of pallor, again, where that muscle is dead, and there's virus. And then sometimes there's little hemorrhages too, there's bleeding. The virus likes to affect the blood vessels too. This is the inside of a gastrointestinal tract. This is up near the junction of where like the crop's coming down and the proventriculus. And these are little ulcers and things, and these arise because they're eating the virus. There's lots of virus contact in the inside of their digestive tract. And so there's actually a lot of damage to the digestive tract. You don't see that in waterfowl because they're getting a more diluted kind of liquid pond water or whatever version. These guys are eating prey with lots of virus in a hunk of meat that's sitting there, you know. So a lot of damage, you guys. This is just a rough disease on these guys. So we've kind of covered this, and I suspect I need to move myself along. But people said bald eagles was one of the first species that was noticed to be dying of high path in the U.S. and down in Florida. And so they may be a sensitive indicator. That's a little plug you can use if you want to study them. The public health people take notice of these little plugs, like, oh, maybe we should support research in bald eagles, you know, for the human health aspect, for the surveillance aspect. So there's something, you know, it may be a sensitive indicator. They were probably overrepresented in the outbreak because they're big, beautiful birds that people notice. And then, you know, I don't know. This is what a lot of you guys in this room know that I'm not knowledgeable about, but like what could be the impacts of this kind of outbreak. It did seem to be the heavy-duty deaths were limited to that year. We haven't seen it since on this level. But then we have other, like Bill Bowerman in here that tells us, you know, about his huge data set and then the mid-north, it was in Michigan, right, Bill? So anyway, it's happening elsewhere. I don't know the impacts as much in other areas, but we knew that we could say that in the southeast regionally, there was a heavy impact that year. That was worrisome that these nest sites were kind of vacated, but then the biologists tell us there's so many eagles down there that there are eagles ready to fill in these sites. But still, it was still sad to think about the longer term effects. So now we're switching to black vultures, which is a whole different kind of epidemiological story. And by the way, yesterday's talk was amazing to learn more about black vulture biology and some of the other aspects that in black vulture studies that we need, especially in the southeast. But here's what we saw with black vultures in the field. very sad, a kind of lethargic, fluffed out vulture who's not doing much. When they're already sick like this, that's kind of it, unfortunately. They're going to die. I feel like the ones that were found were luckier because their course of illness was cut shorter. They didn't have to suffer quite as long, but it's a fast course of illness. And this guy splayed out his wings. He can't even stand. That was not uncommon as well. So it's really sad to look at, I know. I do it to kind of show the impacts. So we had a pretty good sample set ourselves of black vultures coming through, again, mostly a lot thanks to Georgia and Florida and other states in the southeast, especially the Carolinas as well. They were both amazing, North and South Carolina. But most of these birds were very good nutritional condition. They were at sites finding a lot of food and doing very, very well before they died. And they didn't have a long course of disease because they really didn't get thinner by any means. You'll see in a minute. And a lot of them tested positive during that time, like about 80% of our cases. And they had also very distinct patterns of gross lesions like we talked about with the eagles. And we detected a lot of virus in these tissues. So it's not just that they're affected, but they're still harboring a lot of virus at the time they die. So this is where I wanted to show you a normal liver. Okay, this is a very well-conditioned bird. This is all fat, all around the heart, like all between the loops of the intestine. This is a nice normal intestine. It's pink, it's uniform. This is a nice normal liver. It's dark, it's got decently sharp edges and a heart. So that's a normal black body. I mean, it came to our way, so it died, but I think it was maybe a trauma case. So here, just to show you, fat, so nice and fat. They were doing so well. That always makes it harder when we open them, we're like, gosh, this bird was doing well. But again, these rounded liver edges, discolored liver, it was so common. You could almost bank on it. This one looks, it's the same thing. It's large and rounded, has these pale spots. They can look a little different depending on how long the carcass has been on the landscape and things like that. There's some other changes that occur after you die that start to discolor things. But same thing, this big liver. And down here I put a piece of intestine that has reddening, which could be hemorrhage, and then pallor, which is the cells dying again. So that intestine is also very damaged in the vulture. The vulture, we'll talk about in a minute why they get such high doses of virus in this cycle that they were in. So by the end of 2022, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission at least had responded to and collected 2,600 birds. But like I say, that represented many, at least 10x or who knows, 100x more than that. A lot of those ended up counted by USDA. But each site, the biologist said, it's 1 to 700 individuals per site, because some of these were roosting sites, and you'd see like this kind of devastating view where there's a lot of just dead vultures everywhere that you look. And there'll be live vultures up here going, I mean, that's a very easy lunch right there. So that was the unfortunate aspect of it. The vultures started perpetuating their own cycle by just conspecific scavenging. It's smart, right? I mean, they're like, okay, it's just down there and it's available. But it really perpetuated a very prolonged cycle that went beyond like the migration periods, where other things, a lot of times the other birds, you don't see as many cases when it's not during migration, but these guys, it did, because they didn't need the outside world anymore. It got into them via waterfowl initially, I'm sure, or consuming dead, other birds. But at this point, they were just, all they needed was their buddies, unfortunately. So this is, I just kind of like, I don't chuckle in a good way, but it's not a happy laugh. But I mean, look at these kayakers going down a little river in Florida, and then imagine this scene, and I'm guessing they didn't really know, or some of them might have gone, oh, there's some black fuzzy stuff over there. But I mean, they're going through an area where there's a huge high path outbreak and all this devastating scene with these vultures dying. And Florida was very forthcoming with all the things they were trying, and Mark Cunningham was amazing down there sharing information with other states, as especially black vultures started to die in these other states. I mean, really, Florida was the first where we were seeing this. And they tried a lot of things. You might say, well, what can you do to manage an outbreak like this? I mean, unfortunately, the end point is not much. But they did send people out in the field with proper protections, and they tried to clean up these carcasses. They bagged them. They taped off areas, especially state parks where people were, because they said, oh, people don't come in these areas. They tried to limit people access to these areas. They bagged and collected carcasses. This is an incinerator that they had on site, which is extremely expensive to operate and kicks out a lot of nasties into the environment. But, from the public health standpoint, they want to see you incinerate carcasses like these. They're a risk. Other people bury, some people burn. There's a lot of things people try to do when you get a lot of organic matter like this. They warned the public. There was a lot of education. They had to ask rehabilitators not to take these birds in. Some rehabilitators did quarantines and things like that, but really education was key as well. But the bottom line was they found this to be unfeasible. They did not think that they were curbing the outbreak in black vultures in the end, and they would just go out, and every day they would be just as many as they picked up the day before. So it just became impractical to manage these outbreaks, and they really kind of just had to let it burn out, which eventually it kind of has. So the bottom line with some of these vultures is they also could be an indicator species. Their unfortunate activities of scavenging and roosting together and kind of the way they forage and kind of attract each other to where there's food was worked against them in this case. They're probably, tens of thousands. I don't know if I could say hundreds of thousands, but a lot of vultures lost. And probably underreported. A lot of states stopped really looking and reporting it because they knew after the first few roost sites where they'd have hundreds of vultures and they sent us some for testing, they'd stop sending because they know what's going on, and they figure, okay, we're not even going to respond to these reports ourselves on the ground because, they had a handle on it, but then things go very underreported, so it's hard to get like sort of population or things like that level implications. So you guys would understand better than me what this kind of impact can be. But this was kind of the bottom line. We've already covered a lot of this. Bald eagles were unfortunately nesting productively in the time when high path hit, and all the waterfowl dying right near a lot of where they nest along the water, and they're using aquatic environments to feed and forage and hunt, I should say. So that was unfortunate for them. They lost not only the annual productivity that year, but a lot of breeding pairs lost or broken up. Like I say, we didn't see the repeat, luckily. And then we had this crazy cycle, which I think there's going to be a paper submitted soon on this via Mark Cunningham and colleagues about this kind of epidemiologic observation. We're working on kind of the pathology aspect, but the vultures were just the whole thing that we kept getting. When other species stopped coming, because presumably there were less deaths, vultures just a solid year, just a nonstop vulture influx into our diagnostic service. So I'll briefly mention the condors. We've had some amazing talks on condors. I've learned a lot this meeting, and I know Todd's going to talk to us about more in depth and with more knowledge than I'm going to be sharing here, but I just want to say that this, of course, this virus, I didn't even tell you, there's so much to tell about this virus. At the time when these viruses hit, there were apparently high-path viruses introduced on the West Coast at the same time as the one in Canada. There were I've heard 4, maybe more they've figured out by now, high-path viruses introduced around that time. So again, all this mixing and spreading. So the initial outbreak that we saw in the East, you could see it moving west, the patterns, but they had their own problems with viruses introduced, I think also to British Columbia. But nonetheless, birds out west eventually have become affected by this virus, and there's a huge concern for condors, rightfully so, and a lot of people were very quick to see what was happening with the vultures, consider that they may be a good model for a vaccine trial, because they may be the most similar and susceptible species we know of that people could get their hands on, to quickly try to see if they could vaccinate the condors, which Todd will talk to us about, but that's been a huge concern. I have a little bit newer information that folks have been doing serology. We'll talk about serology. That's when you're looking for antibodies in the blood to a pathogen. Some of these birds have survived. Some of these condors have even survived, and they have antibodies at that point. And it's the same as us as humans. People might check your antibody titer if anybody's vaccinated for rabies. Probably not, because you're all bird people. But they check your titer every couple of years to make sure you have antibodies to the virus in case you're exposed, which I'm sure that I have been. I've had raccoon rabies brain in my eye before. I felt it go in. I was like, I should have been wearing glasses. But anyway, big story into condors. I won't take, Todd has better information, but there are some condors that have survived. There are condors that have been vaccinated. Todd will tell us more, but that was a very rapid response by government folks, federal government folks. And then we've talked about, Todd mentioned, this has been in the news. It will probably continue to be in the news. I'm happy when it's in the news from a wildlife standpoint. We need more recognition for these things that are happening, if nothing else, to remind people there's wildlife out there. Wildlife important. We should care about them. So a lot of us that worked with this were trying to field a lot of press peoples. I decided I like them. I like these journalists. They're pretty good people. They're trying to get the things right. So there's a health threat. Bob, I didn't ask you, but I'm sort of quoting you, because Bob said some very wise things, and I loved what he said. He said the potential population risk posed by these viruses to recently recovered species, like the bald eagle, is a threat, basically, but we don't know as much about it as we need to, but there's potential there. There could be a devastating impact to some abundant and secure species, as we learned yesterday, the black vulture, for example. But the threat is ongoing, and we must continue to monitor it. And really, because these viruses are changing. like we had that outbreak, and people go through these lulls where, okay, high path is basically done. It's still here. Like this virus, we didn't know if it was going to disappear after 2022, if it was going to linger, if it was going to continue to have horrible years year after migration season. But it has stayed. It's here. I mean, look what it's doing in the cattle. But it's sort of maybe slowed down for some reason. A lot of these birds have become immune, as many as that we've seen die, so we'll talk about that in 1 minute. But there are a general lack of resources for this kind of work, and so we're constantly battling. But I've been kind of inspired by a lot of the funding areas you guys have used and get to support your work. I think, there's a lot of ways to work together, and I'll probably be in the high path room top. I would love to hear, be involved in, how to raise funds for this kind of work and how to work with you guys on the ground on things like this, how we can help by testing. So the good news is I've kind of let you know that there are folks that we work with, Dave Sonic and Becky Paulson at Squidis, that have been now collecting a lot of blood samples from live birds, including eagles, including some other raptors, working with rehabilitators and field biologists, and realizing that some of them have antibodies, and actually a decent proportion, in areas especially that were hard hit. So as much as we saw death and destruction, their survival, he always likes to say, Dave Sonic likes to say, nature's resilient, and we don't like to think about them suffering a lot and dying, but they're generally resilient, and as a species, a lot of these will come through, and they'll adapt, and they're survivors. But the thing to note is that I find interesting is before this outbreak, raptors really probably didn't have a lot of contact with these viruses. A lot of waterfowl species see a lot of these different viruses all the time, especially low path. And I'll say that there is some, I have it down here at the end, but there is likely some protection, antibody protection to your system, to a subsequent disease, if you have low path exposure in your system, those antibodies. But a lot of raptors did not. They don't necessarily see a lot of those viruses in their environment. So again, Dave and Becky did some work on this, and they found pretty high, 57%. And they do a whole battery of testing to show, first influenza virus exposure, then H5, this particular strain, and H5 and N1, and they kind of whittle it down to okay, these have antibodies to this specific high path virus. But they did in some work show that some black vultures, interestingly in Kentucky and Tennessee, they were not as hard hit, so a lot of their vultures hadn't seen that virus yet, so they may be more at risk until it hits them, and then they'll have losses. But these antibodies can at least help reduce clinical disease, or the disease that we see, the effects on the animal, reduce the shedding into the environment, and they need to get a higher dose the next time. Like they'll be actually, if they have a lower dose, they probably won't be affected by it. So there's some good news here. It's been devastating. We are very lucky to be working with Mike Tincher and Gail Krath at the Rocky Mountain Raptor Program, and Emily Davenport of Rocky Mountain Wildlife Alliance, which we connected last year at RRF to decide to do this. But grassland raptors out west are probably being less studied. A lot of the serology I just mentioned is in the east and the sort of the central part of the U.S. So we wanted to look at all the raptors coming through, especially along the Front Range of Colorado, and with our amazing collaborators. So just future work we hope to present at the meeting maybe is to look at these different raptors, track their progress through rehab, the ones that make it to release that have had past infections. A lot of them now, they're not seeing as many cases, but they may have antibodies. So there is something to be learned. You need kind of long-term data. It's good to follow these birds a little bit longer if you can. So we're going to try to work together and learn what we can from that moving forward, so that we're excited about that. Overall implications, you may ask me, well, what does any of this mean? It's endemic in North America. I think this nasty high-pass strain has been here long enough. It's here. It's not going to, it could not be detected as often, but it's still circulating. It affects people occupationally, obviously, field biologists, rehabilitators, veterinarians. Falconers have to be aware. I know they're a highly aware group of all the different risks. Waterfowl hunters, we haven't talked about waterfowl hunters because they're not really pertaining to raptors, but they're handling lots of waterfowl that have tested positive. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And we briefly touched on personal protection yesterday at one of the afternoon sessions, and hunters aren't going to wear masks and gloves generally when they're hunting and cleaning their harvest. So, a lot of people, we've worked very closely with the virus in our necropsy, and we wear masks, but they're not the best and the tightest of masks, and I'm pretty sloppy, so I'm still healthy. So anyway, the risk to humans is very low, but it's something to be aware of. And if you do have ability to wear gloves and masks, it's better. But anyway, I tell my students, don't do what I'm doing, do the thing you should be doing. But anyway, backyard poultry people are important too in this. They're probably, I would say, it's some of the higher risk, because their birds are outside roaming around. They've been a big part of this. And then what do we do about it? It's horrible to say, but there's not much we can do about it. Vaccination in the condors is a good option because they have their hands on them and they're highly managed species. But in our free-ranging wildlife, there's really no way to make sure you can vaccinate all the bald eagles in Florida or wherever. Like, this comes up all the time. Like, we talked about it with West Nile virus. It's just not practical. So a lot of time, you can do it in zoo and value individual animals in captivity, of course, do it. But, like, it's just not practical as a management aspect for our free-ranging birds. And there's really no way to contain it in the environment. Previous outbreaks, some countries or even some people here talk about, let's just depopulate all the waterfowl in an area. I mean, that's not practical. None of us want to see that happen or even mentioned. You know, biosafety practices in terms of poultry farms, because they're a major part of this. Like, the viruses sometimes originate from the poultry farms and themselves into the environment. It can happen, or there's mixing, or that it gets entered by someone else. I mean, a lot of these different viruses are just in the environment. So, but biosafety, especially on those farms, and especially when you can practice it, is important. Treatment options for animals in the hand, very limited. I mean, we have some great wildlife rehabilitator folk and veterinarians and medical people in here, and they can tell you it's very challenging, maybe not impossible, but the odds are highly stacked against you, for sure, depending what stage the bird comes in. And, you know, some of them are resisting. I'll mention, as a pathologist, I've seen some cases where I even had a lesser scop, I think it was, that had some weird scarring in the pancreas. And in waterfowl, the pancreas is very damaged. It's one of the worst tissues. And I swear, you can't prove it because they're no longer going to test positive or have virus in their system. But I think that was probably a survivor. But I mean, who wants to run off all these scarred up pancreas, you know? But it's not good. You're not as healthy as your buddy that doesn't have that. But anyway, there's survivors. But we need to do more collaborative work because there's so many other pieces to the puzzle of this virus and what it does to wild birds, and especially raptors, because it's been underrepresented in a lot of the past studies are shorebirds and waterfowl. So I have to go back to my favorite virus. It's weird to have a favorite virus, but that's what my PhD was on, this virus, and I actually worked with the Rocky Mountain Raptor program a lot during this time period. So I also have to mention the Carolina Raptor Center because they won't remember, but over 20 years ago, I bugged them as a weirdo little graduate student in Colorado State, and we wanted to do, these are very challenging to do experimental infections on birds in captivity. You don't really want to be doing them, but it's the only way to get certain information where you can know when a bird's infected, what's happening to them, the progression of infection, the shedding, because you know the timeline, you can know how bad the disease gets at a certain time point. So we contacted Carolina Raptor Center and some others, including Rocky Mountain Raptor Program, for non-releasable but healthy raptors that they were going to euthanize. And believe it or not, I don't think I would have the wherewithal to do this at this point, but I solicited and they listened and they sent them across the country and we did a small study. And part of the reason is I love these birds. I know I'm going to take very good care of these birds, house them very well. And I knew if I did the study, I could know that it was done well for the birds in the best way possible. So we did that and we learned quite a bit, I would say. They do get pretty high levels of virus in the blood to the point where they could be infectious to mosquitoes. So again, I flipped viruses on you. I'm not talking about mosquito-borne virus. But we did a lot of subsequent work with Rocky Mountain Raptor Program to follow their birds, to follow the immunity, to see that it was long-term, you know, to look at the clinical aspects, to see how we could apply it to public health so that people would notice and care. Worked with Joan because we decided, well, why not Krista cares? They're always underrepresented in the raptor health kind of literature. So anyway, we learned a lot, and I think we need to do similar things now, and that's kind of what we're trying to do a little bit. And we'd love to work with other folks, and like I said, we got to connect with folks last year, and it resulted that we were doing a project together. And so that's what, well, anyway, I just said all this, but this is just pictures from that time when we were doing these projects on West Nile. So when you do an experimental infection with like West Nile, or if you really want to do it with high path, you have to do it in a containment building. I was really lucky because my advisor had access to this building. He actually ran the building. It had these big rooms and we could empty everything else out. I could lay all this like indoor, outdoor carpet, whatever in there. I remember buying this stuff. I was working at CDC as like a research fellow, and they're like, why are you buying all this stuff? What are you going to use that for? I'm like, you don't need to know. But anyway, I was trying to make the birds as comfortable as I could. You know, they thought I was so weird, but they were doing a lot of experimental. That was right after West Nile hit out west. But anyway, a lot of sick birds in, and we all know West Nile still remains a threat. And at the time, I kind of considered it one of the biggest like pathogen threats to raptors, but it's definitely been trounced by high path. So I must share a little bit if I have a few minutes. Todd, I promise I'll hurry you guys. Do I need to really hurry? Okay, just keep going. Just go faster. I don't have a problem going faster. Red alert, post-mortem pictures, but These are other threats that we see. We've talked about these at this conference. We see a lot of electrocution birds. This is devastating because here's what we see. We see these charred regions of the body. Look at this poor red-tailed hawk, charred. It's horrible, horrible. I'm so depressed when I see these. They're usually very healthy birds. We get a lot of these come through our center. Trauma is probably the #1 thing we see. So many eagles hit by vehicles. I know you guys know all this, but I can't help but show you some stuff. We see a lot of trauma, gunshot trauma. Very sad, very upsetting. There's usually not much we can do when it comes to us. Occasionally a case comes in as a legal case because they suspect gunshot, but unless all those legal channels have been covered, we can't really pursue it as a legal case or figure out what the heck happened or where it was shot. A lot of emaciation. Of course, the young birds, especially this osprey, has no pectoral muscles. This eagle really doesn't either. We see quite a bit of that as a sole diagnosis. And nothing else wrong with them. They just simply couldn't make everything work out for themselves. Lead, I know we have a lot of nice talks on lead this conference. I haven't been able to attend them all, and I'm kind of upset about it because there's so many good talks. Lead in the GI tract on radiographs. It kind of can do a little ulceration in the GI tract, but we see pale heart. Early on, it's heart, dead cells in the heart. Later on, it's scarring in the heart if they survive long enough, but you will see some pallor in the heart. This green stuff around the vein is not specific to lead. We see that with high path. It's because they're not eating that much and they've got a lot of bile coming through their digestive tract. Normally, it would be mixed with food, so you wouldn't see it as much, but you see that with a lot of different infectious toxic diseases in birds. I'm almost done, Todd. This is anticoagulant rodenticides. Aidan O'Reilly has a really good talk. He's been our guru on this topic. We see that, we detect them a lot, as anyone does that looks. But this is just non-clotted blood, just a huge amount of bleeding. They may have trauma on top of it, and it causes more bleeding than it should, so that really kind of makes the diagnosis tricky. But externally, you often see nothing. And then infectious disease, my favorite. So, crazy stuff, pox. Pox lesion on this poor little burrowing owl, but they did take photos a month or 2 later, and it was resolving. Pox should regress and go away, but some birds are unlucky and does not. The lesions on the usually non-feathered skin. Trichomoniasis or trichomonas here in the back of the mouth. We know, especially owls can get that from eating other like pigeons and things. This is a lung that should be nice, uniform pink, and there's some kind of discolored white plaques. Those are fungal plaques with aspergillus. And then West Nile, I wish it was a little blurry here, but it also causes a lot of heart pallor because it's also killing and causing inflammation in areas of the heart as the most predominant lesion, I would say. So underlying any bird that we get in, any wildlife, I'm always thinking, what are these underlying stressors that they're undergoing? And that's when I learned from you guys about the things in the environment that are going on. I don't spend enough time reading, but they're constantly fighting for survival. We know that. We know how they have to be kind of like peak performance athletes, is what one of my colleagues likes to say, to survive, especially things like raptors that need to hunt. So any slight stress, I mean, they're causing sort of stress in the body. You know, we know it. We get stress from work and things like that. It's not great to have that underlying stress. And I feel like with global climate change and even these landscape changes, it's constant stress around our wildlife. So I think we have to be constantly aware and worried about infectious diseases on top of that, because they may be more susceptible to it because of those stresses. And finally, we had some great talks last year at RF about traditional ecological knowledge, and I took that so to heart, and I loved it, and it was very interesting and important and relevant, and I was raised, but not anymore Catholic. I feel guilty about it, but I have not incorporated this into my research yet, but it is my plan, because this is trying to talk to Native Indigenous peoples that know more culturally through their heritage about resources and land and wildlife than I ever could, and try to honor and integrate that into our research. So I just wanted to mention that there are 8 tribes that are recognized by the state in North Carolina. So I thought that was a really important message last year. I loved it, and a year has gone by very quickly, but this has been in my sights to kind of try to work it into some of the work that we do. And a lot of people, at SCWDS especially, and Georgia DNR, Florida, including Sean Lee and Bob, who are here, but a lot of people, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we'd love to work with more of you. USGS also provides funding to us. And I'm sure I don't have time for questions, Todd.